That rhetoric guy. Perhaps one of the most misunderstood, mischaracterized, misapplied, and even the most feared concept in rhetoric and argument is that of bias. So often students will think that an obvious bias must mean that the speaker is untrustworthy. And modern-day politicians frequently have that same mentality, and so they just dismiss their opposition. Bias is so often used as an excuse to ignore or even negate positions and people and reasons and evidence, and sometimes even reality itself. This is a problem, and this video is designed to show you that bias does not automatically mean untrustworthy, and is in fact a critical part of the compromise and relationships inherent in building good conversations. Stick around. So the realization that I had that changed how I viewed bias was in looking at its origin. If we look back to Aristotle's major appeals, ethos, logos, and pathos, we'll find that bias emerges from ethos. That is, it's not an aspect of logic, but it's not an aspect of emotion either. It's an aspect of character. To put it simply, bias can't tell us anything about the substance of an argument because bias isn't a part of the substance. This alone should show us why it is illogical to, for example, dismiss an article solely because the source is considered biased. This would be the equivalent of an ad hominem, using an attack on the source of the argument as your reason to dismiss the argument. Okay, so bias emerges from ethos, character, education, experience, exposure to other people's ethos. But what is it exactly? Now, this is where we begin to have some trouble, because any definition that I offer will have its own connotations, its own negative or positive implied meanings. And this is exactly why confusion surrounds the term. So before I offer some dictionary-like definitions, how about an analogy? If we go back before the days of internet streaming and back before cable TV, back to when TVs had antenna on them, you might get a screen that looks something like this. So this is a kind of random electrical static that we call noise. Every piece of electronics radiates some electromagnetism, and even the universe around us is filled with radiation left over from the Big Bang, what we call the cosmic microwave background radiation. So how did TVs display pictures and sounds if this noise was dominating the screen and, in fact, the universe around us? Well, we tuned our TV sets to isolate and pick up certain signals over others. Does this mean that certain frequencies are more truthful than others? I think it should be clear that such a question is obviously meaningless, because tuning a TV's frequency wasn't about finding truth, but a choice about which perspective to use. In this analogy, bias is the frequency we present our argument from. It's different from others, like different channels are, but this doesn't say anything about the substance of what we present on those channels. Rather, the differences in our frequencies show that we view the situation from a certain lens and have a certain mindset, that we come from different places and histories and experiences, that we're likely better to understand the presentations from our own frequency or on frequencies similar to our own than from someone else's. With that metaphor in mind, let's go back to some formal definitions and see if we can develop a kind of context that allows us to really get a clear understanding of what these frequencies do. All right, definition 1. Prejudice for or against something or someone. Now, right off the bat, this definition may seem a bit negative due to the word prejudice, but realize that, strictly speaking, prejudice simply means to prejudge, which, depending on the context, may actually be a good and useful thing. Example, you see an absolute stranger walking down the sidewalk, and you prejudge that they would rather be alive than dead, because that's what you believe. Now, you could be wrong about them because you've made a judgment pre-knowing them. But as a matter of ease and instinct, you tend to project your own beliefs onto the world around you. Prejudice is good or bad depending on the context and substance of what is said. And that's precisely what this definition highlights, that bias doesn't say anything about the subject, but how someone is likely to approach the subject. Definition 2. A systematic, rather than random, distortion. Okay, again, this definition at first reads negative due to the word distortion. But if we think back to the TV analogy, my channel and your channel and the noise are each kinds of distortion. They are lenses with which to view the subject, and some lenses are better suited to showing things on very small scales, and some lenses work better at large scales, and some lenses show entirely new things under different kinds of light. Distortion in this case is like prejudice in the previous case. It's about contrasting perspectives. Now, the real strength of this definition lies in the contrast it draws between a random lens and a systematic one. Bias is pattern, not chaos. Bias isn't about randomly dismissing someone because you don't like them. Rather, it's a pattern of thinking that makes you more likely to act in a certain way. Definition 3. A mindset or worldview driven by certain core beliefs, personal preferences, and sociological trends. Person A grew up in a devoutly religious household, lives in a very conservative part of the country, and hasn't traveled much outside of their region. Person B grew up with no religious indoctrination, is surrounded by progressive thinking people, and travels often to places outside of their comfort zone. Now, if you put these two people together and you make them talk about a contentious subject, let's say abortion, well, they're likely to have gut reactions to that subject. And those gut reactions are likely to take them in massively different directions. They're both biased. And recognizing those biases isn't about showing who is right and who is wrong, but predicting what they are likely to say and how and why they are likely to say it. Okay, so some people might get through that definition section and say, well, if bias isn't about the content of an argument, but only about the speaker, why do we care so much? Why not just talk about the argument itself? Well, the simplest response that I can offer is this. The content of an argument is not sufficient on its own to change someone's mind. Here's a great example of what I mean. The scientists Richard Dawkins and Neil deGrasse Tyson were once at a conference together. Now, Dawkins is sometimes known for his rather sharp critiques and harsh rhetoric, whereas Tyson is a little bit more positive and kind of upbeat in his analysis. Their differences in style led Tyson to say this.
You're a professor of the public understanding of science, not professor of delivering truth to the public. And these are two different exercises. One of them is you put the truth out there, and like you said, they either buy your book or they don't. Well, that's not being an educator. That's just putting it out there. Being an educator is not only getting the truth right, but there's got to be an act of persuasion in there as well. Persuasion isn't always, here's the facts, you're either an idiot or you're not. It's here are the facts, and here is a sensitivity to your state of mind, and it's the facts plus the sensitivity, when convolved together, creates impact.
Impact. Arguments are not about yelling your position out into space and tearing down all of the people who disagree with you. Arguments are conversations where you are a participant in a greater whole. And the purpose of such discussions isn't about me against them, but us changing things, changing minds, progressing with knowledge, improving understanding, creating more diverse, inclusive, and coherent worldviews. So here are some of the consequences and implications of thinking about rhetoric this way. 1. Analyzing the bias of your opponent will expose you to how they think, and thereby how you are most likely to change their mind. If someone identifies as a conservative capitalist, simply giving them the facts about how poverty is a problem is most likely not going to make them reevaluate their position, because their position is biased towards viewing poverty as a personal failing rather than a failing of the economic system that they like. If someone is a 1960s style hippie, constantly appealing to kind of a nationalistic patriotism probably won't work either, because their position is biased towards viewing that kind of patriotism as immoral. If you want to change minds, you need, in Tyson's words, that sensitivity to their way of thinking. Analyzing the bias of others should help you connect with your intended audience. 2. Reflecting on your own bias will reveal your personal blind spots and show you where you are likely to either be unfair or inflexible. If you're a deeply religious person, you may believe that your sense of morality comes directly from your God or your religious doctrine, and therefore you may be inclined to view atheists as inherently immoral. Well, this is a blind spot, because secular humanism, for example, is an ethical system held by millions of atheists that doesn't rely on a God. And talking to a secular humanist as if they are immoral would sound insulting and dismissive and rather ignorant. If, on the other hand, you're an atheist, you may believe that religious people are simply brainwashed, and therefore you may be inclined to treat a Christian as if they haven't ever thought about their position. Well, likewise, this would also be a blind spot, because there are plenty of religious people who have spent their lives trying to explain their beliefs. Understanding your own bias should help you prevent yourself from making bad assumptions. 3. Identifying the bias of a source will allow you to adjust your skepticism and trust in the claims made by that source. Saying that Fox News commentators are conservatively biased, which they are, doesn't reveal whether their commentary is true or not. Instead, because bias is a part of a relationship with an audience, it means that conservative viewers will be more trusting and less skeptical of the claims offered, whereas non-conservative viewers will be the opposite, less trusting and more skeptical of the claims made. If you're reading an opinion article and the author is not an expert in the field that they're talking about, then your skepticism towards their claims about that subject or field should be far more active. And vice versa, if they are an expert, you should tend to be more trusting and confident in the positions that that person offers. Identifying source bias shouldn't make you dismiss opinions altogether. It should help train your application of skepticism. Okay, some concluding thoughts. Unbiased is a simplistic fantasy that ignores all of the relevant factors in composing arguments and having discussions and changing minds. No one is unbiased, but that doesn't matter unless your bias prevents you from investigating reality. There's been a huge push in modern day journalism to appear neutral, as if this would somehow remove bias from the equation and only allow pure fact to arise. But this creates a bias of its own, a hugely unfair bias at that, because it treats all possible positions as if they were all equal, which of course is ridiculous. This has led to news stations, for example, having on a scientist to debate climate change, which is factual, with some commentator who denies science. Right, so person A says 2 plus 2 equals 4, and person B says 2 plus 2 equals 38. So let's put them side by side to duke it out, and you, the audience, get to decide who's actually right and who is wrong. And we, the journalists, get to just remain neutral. No, that is not how it works. You, the audience, listen to the news to become informed. And it's the journalist's job to inform you, not offer some contrived show of being 50-50, like, I can't tell the difference between something factual and something made up because I'm so unbiased. A newscaster only having on a scientist to talk about science is not somehow biased against the truth simply because there isn't someone there side by side who disagrees with them. In fact, this kind of thinking, by definition, favors the untrue, because by giving the non-factual side equal time and equal respect, your audience is more likely to be not uninformed, but misinformed. I prefer a journalistic push toward objectivity and integrity rather than neutrality. And this is what I would call a bias toward truth. Neutrality might make you say, Republicans say X and Democrats say Y. Whereas objectivity might make you say, the Republicans say X, which is kind of incorrect because A, and the Democrats say Y, which is kind of correct because B. Now, in this example, the Republicans might get really angry and try to bash your news station as biased, and elected Republicans may even refuse to appear on your news program in the future because they feel personally attacked. But you did your job. You investigated reality with an eye toward objectivity and then reported that to your audience with integrity. Now, this isn't to say that the truth is easy to come by, or that every attempt at objectivity won't occasionally get it wrong. In fact, truth is often incredibly complex, requiring knowledge of lots of different factors at play. But by being afraid of bias, you reduce your chances at discovering the truth. Embracing your bias with honesty and integrity, while critiquing the bias of others with care and skepticism, will reveal far more truth than trying to remain neutral. And indeed, this may be the critical factor in creating better conversation.